Goodwood has been one of the highlights of the horse racing calendar since 1802, and for a short time in this century, famous for motor racing as well. Goodwood is the home of the Dukes of Richmond and their families. The present Duke, the 9th, now lives nearby, and his son, the Earl of March, lives in the house and runs the estate as a flourishing business concern. And it was Lord March who began the family's story in the ballroom wing. It's a very symmetrical design here.
Well, this is the 3rd wing, the ballroom wing, and this is the last wing to be built. And the first floor, as you can see here, is actually up above the bottom of the windows.
Oh, I see. Yes, it is. Yes. Why is that?
And that was because it was necessary to accommodate this picture, and therefore the ceiling in this room was raised above the level of where otherwise it would have been.
And this is Charles I here.
This is a Van Dyck picture of Charles I with his queen, Henrietta Maria, Charles II as a baby boy, and Princess Mary, the little baby in the arms of the Queen.
And it was that little boy in blue, Charles II, that started your family
It was he who started the whole thing off, yes.
It's a lovely picture.
It's a lovely picture, but it's also a very interesting picture historically, because this picture was sold by Cromwell to the Duke of Orleans, and the Duke of Orleans later handed it to his descendants, and one of those was beheaded in the French Revolution, and Robespierre's men sold it then to an English banker, and the English banker sold it to the 3rd Duke. And so this picture has been through the hands of 2 royal families, one English, one French, and 2 revolutionaries, one English and one French.
And it's now back with its own family?
It's back with the original family.
That's lovely. And that little boy there, Charles II, is picked up in another picture you have with him.
Indeed.
As a young
Here
boy.
he is, again, as a young man. This is a very interesting Van Dyck picture, because Van Dyck normally painted several versions of his pictures, but this one is unique. This picture doesn't exist anywhere else. And there he is. His eyes look very wicked, don't they?
They do.
A foretaste, I always think, of the merry monarch to be.
Absolutely, it does look wicked. You've got a picture of the merry monarch, same eyes.
Same eyes, indeed, and the merry monarch, here he is, when he was king, some years later, of course.
Now, those crown jewels aren't the same as the ones in his father's picture.
No, those crown jewels are new ones that were made at the time of the Restoration, because Cromwell, the old vandal, went and melted down the crown jewels which were in the earlier picture of Charles I.
He was a vandal, wasn't he? So those were new, and still, as I say, the same wicked look in his eyes.
Indeed, and then the clock beneath the picture is a clock of the time of Louis XIV, and there it is still today, and still ticking, and has been ticking since their time.
Amazing, lovely. Now, Charles II's wife was Baron, so how did your family get going?
Ah, well, Charles II's wife was Baron, but of course he had many lady friends, and one of them was this lady here, Louise de Kerouaille. She was a French lady sent over to the English court by Louis XIV to spy on Charles II. And she was pretty successful, because she got so close to Charles II that she gave birth to a son by him.
That's pretty close.
Yeah, it's not bad, I think, in terms of achieving your objectives.
Don't you actually know the date of conception?
Yes, we do, and it was in fact at a seat of the Duke of Grafton, who is another duke directly descended from Charles II, at a place called Euston, near Newmarket. But the significant fact for our family is that it was on an evening between 2 days racing at Newmarket. So horse racing was built into the family blood from the start.
Almost obliged to build racecourses, weren't you?
I think so, yeah.
Did she continue to spy, do you think?
Well, she certainly went on spying. It wasn't clear whether she was spying more for Louis XIV or more for Charles II, but she was certainly spying for both, and she was also receiving sums of money from both of them.
And a duchy from both of them.
That's right.
Yes. Amazing woman. And this is the product of
well, then their product of the liaison was the first Duke of Richmond, who was a royal duke. He held various offices, such as being Master of the Horse. He was a Knight of the Garter. He was rather like the Duke of Gloucester or the Duke of Kent would be today. The best thing he did for the family was that he bought a little hunting lodge called Goodwood. And from that little hunting lodge, this whole house eventually developed. As for the rest of his life, the less said the better. It was spent very largely in drunkenness and debauchery.
The first Duke, of course, knew he'd never succeed to the throne, but some of the illegitimate children tried, didn't they?
Well, this one here, the Duke of Monmouth, he was another illegitimate child of Charles II, but he did try very hard to become legitimized so he might become king.
And came to a sticky end in the process.
He came eventually to a very sticky end. I believe they had to take the axe to his head 6 times, and even then the knife was still necessary.
Ooh, that's very nasty,
Horrible.
isn't it? Move away from him. This is
Yes, quickly.
through the ballroom to...
Well, here we're coming
room.
in now to the yellow drawing room, perhaps the loveliest room in the house, and the room that's most important to us because there's much in here to do with the third Duke.
And this lovely porcelain that you've
And this
got.
porcelain. The third Duke bought this porcelain when he was ambassador in Paris. It's probably one of the finest collections of saved china in the country. Indeed, not only in this country, but in the world. And as you will see by looking at some of the detail, there are some lovely pictures of not only of flowers, but also of animals and of birds. And indeed, on some of the pictures of birds and animals, the actual names are written on the plate.
Very beautiful. And then, of course, you have the pictures of the third Duke above.
Well, here
Above
is
here.
the third Duke. Here he is, painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds, in this lovely scarlet jacket.
Marvellous. Although the flesh tints that were never quite right in a Reynolds, whether they faded.
They faded a bit, but it's a most sensitive face, don't you think?
Yes.
It's my favourite picture in the house. Perhaps that's because I admire him so much. And this picture is again of the third Duke by Chevalier Mengs.
He's even slightly got the eyes of his great-grandfather, hasn't he?
Yes, well, they follow on through. I think that my father's got them as well.
Yes, indeed. Well, what exactly did the third Duke do? I know he was...
Well, he did
important.
so many things. He did, of course, build this house, or the major part of it. He intended that it should be an octagon, that it should be a great house for entertaining his friends. And finally, when he died, he had already run out of money, and he built 3 sides. In fact, when he died, he was in debt to the tune of £180,000, which was quite a large sum in those days.
Which was, what, the beginning of the...
1804, yes, the beginning of the 19th century.
And what kind of a man was he?
Well, he was really larger than life. He was not only a duke, and therefore in those days extremely important, but he was a very big man in every sense, a real visionary. I mean, he did so many different things. To give you a few examples, he formed the Royal Horse Artillery at Goodwood. He formed the Royal Ordnance Survey, which were really the first maps of this country. He built the Martello Towers to defend us from the French, which you can still see in the Channel to this day. He even advocated universal male suffrage in the House of Lords in 1783. Now that's 50 years before the Reform Bill.
All that, and he never achieved legitimate children.
He's the only duke who had no son to inherit. He did in fact have one illegitimate daughter who was recognized, and after his wife's death, 3 more daughters by the housekeeper. Well then, of course, George III, whose picture we see here, didn't care for the third Duke very much. Indeed, the third Duke's most astonishing feat of all was that during the American War of Independence, he actually sailed his yacht through the British fleet in Southampton water, not far from here, flying the flag of the independent American colonies.
All on his own?
Indeed, he did. Though, of course, there were many other landowners at that time who did support the American colonists, so he wasn't absolutely alone.
He couldn't have been too popular, I wouldn't have thought. How long did did your family keep the French title, originally conferred on Louise de
Well, strictly speaking, we still have it. My father is still, in fact, the French Duke, though, of course, all French titles were abolished at the Revolution.
This is a French picture?
Yes, this is Cardinal Fleury by Rigaud. He was a great man. He was a cardinal for many years, and indeed a friend of Louise de Querouaille. And then finally, he became Prime Minister of France at the age of 75, which shows that patience is indeed rewarded. And he continued as Prime Minister until he died at the age of 90, unbelievably.
And it was given to her, the picture?
Yes, indeed. And, of course, whether she, in fact, confessed her sins to Cardinal Fleury or not, we don't know.
You've said a lot about the third Duke. What about the second Duke?
Well, the second Duke, like the third Duke, was a great patron of the arts. And principally, he brought over a gentleman called Canales, as he was called in Venice, known by us now as Canaletto. And he brought him over from Venice, and he set him up in his London house, which was called Richmond House. And from that house, Canaletto painted 2 great views of London. And this is one of them.
Oh, I see, this one here. So this was one of the first English paintings, the first, in fact, that Canaletto painted?
Yes, it was. And there is the second Duke, giving an instruction to somebody. And also in the picture, you can see the spire of St. Martin's in the Fields. Of course, Trafalgar Square hadn't happened then. And the big building there still exists, the banqueting house. And of course, it was out of a window in the banqueting house onto Whitehall there that Charles I stepped and put his head down and was beheaded.
So there's a connection
So the
all
connection
the time back.
Made, yeah.
What sort of date was this? Because the scenery's changed so much.
It was the middle of the 18th century.
Yes. And this is the other one here.
And this is the other one, painted by Canaletto from the front windows of Richmond House. And there you can see very obviously St. Paul's Cathedral. You can see a lot more of it there, of course, in the middle of the 18th century than you can now. And on the Thames, 2 barges which look Italian.
They do. The whole thing's very Venetian, isn't it?
Very. But in fact, those are not Venetian. That's the Lord Mayor's barge sailing down the middle of the river. And then in the foreground there we have those little rowing boats which are really London taxis.
What happened to the house?
Well, the house stood approximately where New Scotland Yard stands today, and unfortunately, almost at the end of the century, it burnt down, and that was the end of that.
The Dukes of Richmond have usually been close to the Crown and the historic events of their day. In the dining room, Lord March remembered one major turning point in our history. Now, this is the dining room, which your family still use, don't they?
Yes, we don't use it every day, obviously. I can't somehow see my wife and I sitting at either end of this table every night like my grandfather and grandmother did. But we do use this room about 15 times a year on big occasions like the July race meeting and the International Dressage Championships. And we maintain here the long tradition of lavish hospitality. And indeed, we do that really in the house with our company entertainment and product promotions and that sort of thing.
The house is very much used.
It really is used all the time.
Quite a few famous people have sat round this table, haven't they?
Yes, many sovereigns and royal people. In fact, perhaps most famously, in 1814, the Tsar of Russia and a number of other monarchs who came to this country to visit the Prince Regent at that time. And they sat here and ate a rather sumptuous meal, I believe.
It was rather a premature celebration, wasn't it?
Well, it was, because it was in one sense celebrating the fact that Napoleon was incarcerated in Elba, and they thought that he would remain there forever.
Which leads us very nicely to the famous ball just before the Battle of Waterloo.
Well, that's right, because Napoleon made a bit of a comeback, and the Duke of Wellington asked the Duchess of Richmond if she would give a ball in Brussels, where she and the Duke were living at the time, mainly to deflect Napoleon's spies and also to get Napoleon on the move. And in this picture, we see the Duke and Duchess receiving their guests in the background there, and the Duke of Wellington, and here he is being told by his aide that Napoleon is on the move, and next to him on his left, the Duke of Brunswick, who was slain by midday the following day on the field of battle. And here, lounging in the chair, this young man is the Prince of Orange, and the Prince of Orange, the aide to the Prince of Orange was the Earl of March, same title as mine, who was the son of the Duke, of course. And here we have the Prince of Orange, and he's talking to a young girl who you never know could be Lady Sophia Cecil, who was a young member of our family. And I remember my grandmother, before she died, telling me that she talked to a very old lady once who was Lady Sophia Cecil, and she told my grandmother what happened at the ball. And my grandmother told me.
And that could well be her.
It could be a girl of 14 or 15, couldn't it?
Yes.
And he was a young man of only about 21 at the time.
It's incredible that the Duke of Wellington went to the ball and stayed there when he kept getting messages through the evening that things were happening.
Well, I think, don't you, after all, it was a bit of a plot, the whole thing, and the Duke of Wellington stayed there because he you know, knew he'd been told that Napoleon was on the move, and then it's said, of course, that the Duke of Wellington turned to his friend during the evening, the Duke of Richmond, and said, anybody got a map? Because although no doubt he had some maps, the movements that were taking place were ones for which he had not got an appropriate map. And it's said that somewhere in an upstairs room they found an appropriate one, and they all settled round it to decide how they were going to plot the battle.
The same evening? The
same evening, and many of the officers who were present are said to have gone straight from the ball, straight to the battle, still in their ball clothes.
That's amazing, isn't it?
And of course, he won the battle, but as he said, it was a damned close-run thing.
Lovely service. This is the Waterloo service, part of your Waterloo service.
Well, this is a set of china commemorating basically the Battle of Waterloo, which was given by the citizens of Brussels to the Duchess afterwards as a sort of thank you, I suppose, for having laid on the ball. And it shows pictures of various buildings in the area of Waterloo itself, and also pictures of soldiers of regiments that fought there. But more particularly, one of the cups actually has Goodwood House on it. No flagpole and no chimneys, but otherwise it looks just, no magnolias. But otherwise it's Goodwood House as it is today.
Somebody went to a great deal of trouble, didn't they?
They certainly did.
The keenest equestrian member of the family is Lady March, who drove me up to the top of the Sussex Downs.
And there's the race course.
And there's the race course, there's the new stand. Looks rather like a ship, I always think, from here.
When was that built?
That was built 2 years ago, and it was a tremendous effort, and we had great help from the levee board, and we were enabled to build what we think is a very attractive and practical stand.
It does look like a ship. Was it meant to?
I don't think particularly. The ropes on the top are in fact to hold it down. The wind gets underneath the concrete roof there.
Many visitors think Goodwood the most beautiful racecourse in the country, perched on the top of these great hills. And I can see why, even on a grey, blustery day like this one. You've got a picture in the house of, not this stand, but an old stand with lots of famous people.
Yes, a balcony just like this, with daughters, Edward VII, 3 daughters standing, I think almost exactly where we're standing now. And it also has the Prince of Wales in it, and Princess Alexandra, and rather amusingly Gilbert and Sullivan.
It's a bit of a cheat, actually,
yes,
isn't it? It's got all sorts of theatrical
It's a lovely picture, and it's got lovely colours in it. It's very, very festive and very much garden party atmosphere.
Obviously not a day like today.
Not a day like today, no. I think that they would have been in a lot of trouble in their costumes of those.
I wonder if that's why they changed the date from March to July,
I should think it was partly the going as well. It would have been very heavy early in the year up here. We get a lot of low cloud, and it really sits down on this hill, and it gets very, very damp up here.
And very cold.
And very cold, always very cold.
And yet glorious Goodwood is renowned for its sunshine.
We are lucky. That week almost always is fine. I can only remember once when it had to be cancelled from wet weather.
But the stables are more frequently used for the dressage events which Lady March has recently brought to Goodwood. She loves anything which involves their beautiful horses, but it all has to fit in with her other responsibilities. Lady March, we've seen your interest in the dressage and the horses, but what about actually running this house and living in it as a home?
Well, it has its problems, as you can imagine. It's quite difficult, just the mere size and distance that one has to go to find a child that's fallen down and cut itself or whatever might have happened. I didn't realise before we came here just what an enormous difference the distances were, the time it adds on. You're getting ready for something and you suddenly remember you've left something upstairs. It takes actually 2 minutes to get up there and down again. You know, you can't, or telephones one end of the house to the other. And you say to somebody, oh, hang on, I'll just get my diary. And you've gone for 5 minutes, you know, they think you've cut off or something. You haven't, you've just gone to get wherever it is.
Because when you first came, the children were very small,
Yes,
weren't
they were. The youngest was only 2, and very surprised to find herself in quite such a large place. Had a lovely time in the ballroom, where there's an enormous mirror down the end of the room, and she used to start the other end and run towards it. You couldn't get her out of there. She thought that was the most marvellous game.
Did you ever lose her?
Yes, I did. I had one awful night when she climbed out of her cot just after we'd gone upstairs and the house was in darkness. I went along to tuck her up and she wasn't there. And you don't know where to start to look. And we came back down and turned all the lights on, and there she was, solemnly climbing up the main staircase, which is huge, clad in her red little sleeping suit, clutching a huge thing of crayons and saying, oh, I just wanted to do my drawing. It was 10 o'clock at night. It wasn't a very good idea. But it was frightening.
Have you got a large domestic staff?
No, we've got quite a small one now. Marvellous people who've been with us a long time. 2 we brought down with us from Warwickshire 14 years ago. And they're a real team and they're marvellous. They'll turn their hands to anything. But, of course, a third of the number that used to be here. So everybody has to do a bit of anything.
And presumably you do too?
And I do too. I say I'm really the tweenie now that has to fill in when everybody else is off. But one has to be able to do anything really, from cooking to shutting up the house or cleaning or whatever.
Now, exactly what do you do? Because one doesn't get the impression of Lady March with a hoover, for instance.
Well, it's a common sight. It happens very often. We often have all the children down at the weekend, which is 5 plus a daughter-in-law. And, for instance, the dining room, I always help our cook lay up for the next meal and hoover the general chaos that the others have left behind them.
Is it possible to make it a home, in fact?
Yes, I thought it was going to be difficult when we first got here, and they all said, oh, Mummy, it's not going to feel like home, we don't know where you are. And one of the reasons we put in a lot of telephones was so that the house is fairly easy to get in touch with one person or the other. But no, it was difficult. We decided in the end to put the children along this wing on either side of our room, so that we were in fact all in one area of the house, and they have connecting doors through the bedrooms, and it works rather well. When they were little, particularly,
and
it worked.
This room?
This is our family room. It's usually full of school homework and bits of this and that they've all left behind them.
But even in here, you've got some very valuable, well, books.
Yes,
certainly.
we've got lovely books. They are very special, but they're a lovely background, aren't they, in a room?
Beautiful.
They make a lovely.
And the
Very
gallery.
friendly, I think, yes, and the children, of course, have always adored that. They run round and round that. We have 2 Siamese cats that think it makes a marvellous slide, too. So it gets rather different use to what it was put there for.
But preserving books like this must be
Yes,
difficult.
that's an awful worry. We've just spring cleaned this room, which means taking every book out and dusting it. And sometimes they have to be oiled. But the cleaning is a very big headache. We have to try and get everybody together at once, sort of 6 people. And we have special hoovers and machines that go up all around the tops, and we have a small scaffolding on wheels that's moved around.
And do you take responsibility for that?
I usually plan it, yes. Yes, I do, this end of the house particularly. I usually plan when all the work will be done.
What sort of decorative order was it in when you came?
It hadn't been lived in for 12 years, so everything needed doing. There wasn't a cushion or a lampshade All the wiring had to be redone, all the plumbing, and every wall and chair recovered. I think we did 56 rooms in the end.
How much part did you play in that?
Most of the sort of arranging of the actual interiors, but we had a marvellous architect who was always great help.
What sort of decisions did you have to make? Because presumably some things had to go and some things had to be renewed.
Well, we knocked down quite a bit at the sort of other end of the house. We knocked down all the old kitchens and sculleries and places that just needed endless scrubbing. And it really was appalling. It was just all stone and wood and awful floors to try and so bumpy you couldn't put machines on them, so all that went. And we built a lovely new kitchen and the dining room, which was the old butler's sitting room. We turned that into a dining room, which is next to our kitchen, so that's very much easier to run when we're on our own.
That's just for the family?
That's just for the family.
And how much do you entertain there and how much in the main house?
Well, it's quite funny. We have a sort of system of ordinary dinner party when there's about 8, and we use our dining room. Anything that goes over 12 goes into the large dining room, but there's a gap between the 12 and the 16 that ought to have, so we never quite know what to do then. But we have 16 in the dining room and the state dining room, upwards to about 28. And after that, we have to go to the ballroom. Yes, he can't bear being away from me, so he's a lurcher we rescued, and he doesn't like it if he can't be with me.
Does he want to come in, do you think?
Yes, he probably does. He's Gilly, what are you doing? Yes, he's a rescued dog that we got when he was 2 years old, and he was in a very poor state, so he's very worried when I'm out of his sight.
How old is he now?
He's 6.
Yes.
Very fast indeed. And I think it's a lovely place for lurchers with so much space. He's half deerhound, half greyhound.
Good heavens.
We've got a smooth-coated one as well.
Mm.
But he makes an awful noise when he's left anywhere else.
Do you regret in any way that you have, in order to live here and to have the facilities of Goodwood, that you have to open your house to the public?
No, not really. We can't hear when there's anybody in the ballroom, or we can't hear cars arriving. So it's not difficult from that point of view, and also we feel the house was built to entertain people in, to be used, and we're very happy people should enjoy it and see the things in it and use it for what it was built for, really.
The other attraction here, the Goodwood Motor Circuit, was started by Freddie March, the 9th Duke of Richmond, after the last war, and it was a great success. He preferred the combustion engine to the horse.
I was born at a moment when most young men had given up wanting to be engine drivers, and they were sort of car mad and motorbike mad and aeroplane mad, and I was one of them. And yes, indeed, when I succeeded, I was very busily engaged with cars and with aircraft in the business in London.
So you brought that here, and you started up an airfield, but quite a small one.
Yes, I actually learnt to fly in 1929, which is quite a year or two ago. And about 1936, I started up a small field here with a hangar and 2 small aeroplanes. And those were the days when you flew by railway line, as you know. But,
I don't, did you?
Yes, indeed. Oh, yes. That was long before the days of radio in aircraft. Quite exciting.
You just had 2 planes?
I had 2.
So when did it expand?
Well, it didn't. The war came and put an end to it all. You see, the existing airfield, which was also the motor track, was an RAF satellite station for Tangna. And it was at the end of the war when somebody suggested to me that we might turn this into a motor circuit. And as I'd done a lot of racing at Brooklands in the late 20s and 30s, it all sort of gelled. And
when you were in fact Freddie March before?
That's correct.
Yes.
Yes.
So you knew some of the early motor racing?
Well, I knew a great number of them very well. Treasured memories there are too, most of them.
So there must have been quite a lot of excitement when you decided to open the racetrack?
Well, I think there was. I was
very excited myself. There was an awful lot of surprise. People, it was quite new to the locality. And, of course, we were tremendous noisemakers, which upset a great number. But people realized in the end that really the whole thing wasn't so ghastly. And it went on very successfully as a motor racing circuit for 18 years.
It was quite dangerous to begin with, though, wasn't it?
No, it was much safer than most of the other circuits in this country. Because being an airfield perimeter track, it didn't have horrible things on the edges of the corners.
Didn't you build one of the first chicanes here?
I built that, or rather we built that, in order to bring the speed down at a certain part of the track just before the pits, because we didn't want people getting into trouble and coming backwards into the starting line.
But Stirling Moss broke the record again and again on that track.
Yes, yes. He and Mike Hawthorne and Parnell were very much the stars in those days. Until poor Stirling came to grief, of course. Nobody really knows why.
He had his dreadful crash here.
He had his crash here.
Did he ever race again afterwards?
I don't. No, he didn't seriously. I think he thought he might begin to try, but he realised that his reactions weren't good enough, I think.
Weren't you rather tempted to get back into one?
Yes, very. But I realised I was just that little bit too old. You don't want to be too old to do that, you know.
So why did racing actually stop here?
It stopped for a very simple reason, which was not understood by a great number of enthusiasts who were furious with me. The track is very small. It's 2.4 miles round, and the boundary is very near the track all round. Consequently, the spectators are of nature have to be very near the circuit, and we couldn't get them further away. And cars, unlike horses, get faster and faster every year. And whereas they started off with a record lap speed of, I've forgotten what it was now, but I mean, say it was something like about 76 or something of that sort. They were getting, they ended up by doing something like about 140 miles an hour at the end of the straight, which was only a few feet off the main road. And I'd been watching this for some time, and I said, I'm afraid there's only one way out here, otherwise we're going to have a holocaust. So we stopped after 18 years.
How do you see the future of Goodwood?
I've given up forecasting futures because I've been so wrong so often. I don't see it, I just hope. It'll be all right, provided the economy is right, generally.
In the hands of your son?
He's a very capable chap, my son, as no doubt you've discovered.
But there was one more discovery to make, in a room still associated with the Crown. Is this room part of the original hunting lodge?
Well, it's a room that was added onto the original hunting lodge by the third Duke, specially to house these tapestries.
Oh, they're lovely, aren't they? They're French.
Yes, they're Gobelin tapestries with scenes from Don Quixote. They were in fact ordered by Louis XV, but he didn't want all of them, and the third Duke managed to pick up a few of them and, as I say, built this room and put them in here. There you see Don Quixote leaning on a sort of spear, and he's listening to this sculpture, which is called the Enchanted Head. And he's listening to what the head is saying. What he doesn't know is that the head is piped into the room next door, and somebody is speaking through the end of the pipe. And I always say that he's having the experience that chairmen and others in positions of responsibility have, because the person who is speaking through the pipe is saying what they know he wants to hear.
That's marvellously inventive, not
Isn't it?
Yes, very good. What about this one?
Well, this one here, he really does look stupid, doesn't he? And his friend has a very smug expression on his face, because here he's been out looking on his horse for the mystical helmet that had some magical properties. And in fact, he came across a barber, and that's the barber fleeing in the background. and he's stolen the barber's bowl, and he's stuck it on his head. And in fact, his friend Sancho here has stolen the barber's horse because it was better than his own. That's why he's no doubt looking so pleased, and left his own horse behind. A rather silly story, but still quite fun.
How do you decide how much to restore something and how much to leave it?
Well, on the whole, I think the best rule is to leave alone as far as possible. But on the other hand, there are the ravages of time, and things do wear out.
Like,
and then something has to be done.
Like the chairs in this room, for instance?
Well, like the chairs. Here we've got this set of Louis XV furniture with the original covers. That is, the covers are something like 250 years old, and some of them are in pretty bad shape. Now, what do we do? Do we try to restore the cover, which can never be done really as it was originally, or do we take the covers off and put new ones on?
Have you made the decision?
We have not yet made the decision. We are going on having the argument among ourselves.
Very difficult.
Very difficult indeed.
Of course, we started the story of the house with Charles II, who
Yes.
started the family. And royalty has continued to come here. You've had a lot of Privy Council meetings here in this room, haven't you?
Yes, in fact, there have been 5 meetings of the Privy Council in this room. More meetings than in any other room in any other house in the country other than the sovereign's own houses. The reason, of course, was because the end of the parliamentary session and the July race meeting came together, and the Queen or King was often here, and it was necessary to put parliamentary business through quickly.
So Edward VII came, for instance.
Edward VII held a council here, and in fact, of the 5 council meetings, 3 of them have been held by the present Queen in this room.
History continues.
It does indeed. And I think that makes a good point about Goodwood, that it's not a museum, that it didn't all happen in the past, that history happens here today.